Hello, my name is Pulkit Vyas. I am a third year student pursuing BTech in Computer Science Engineering from Bennett University. Today I have chosen the topic for this seminar as spiking neural network for robotics application. And with this seminar, I would like to give the audience a taste of what spiking neural networks are, how they benefit robotics, and what kind of real-world applications are being used in the field of robotics using spiking neural networks, and maybe even inspire you to take a deeper dive into the field. So let's get started with the presentation. So before we talk about spiking neural networks or neural networks, deep learning or any kind of AI, we first need to understand why the classical systems don't really work. So what I've written here is that the kinematics and dynamics don't work for complex robots, but that would be severely discrediting the work of all the amazing scientists and engineers that they put into and the feats and accomplishments that they get for creating such complex robots like quadrupeds and humanoids. The issue that arises are because of certain points that are: number one, these systems fail to adapt to unknown situations. So basically, for every task that the robot has to do or anything that it has to percept in its environment, we first need to engineer and design all these algorithms and ordinary differential equations and stuff, and then we need to implement them into the robots and deploy them to do those certain tasks. So that obviously takes a lot of human resources and time to actually sit down and to work on all these algorithms and see how they fit into these controlled environments, and then use them to drive the robots. So what we get at the end of this entire process is a very non-generalizable model of a robot that cannot be extended for further use cases. So a robot model that you are developing for a humanoid might not be able to generalize to a quadruped, even though they are both legged system and uh, need to be deployed in same environment. So these are the kinds of problems that arise from classical systems. Now, if we go ahead to AI-based solutions, so something that is gaining a lot of popularity these days is that you have a lot of data and you have some very powerful models that you can use, but in general, a lot of AI solutions don't work either. So there are a couple of reasons why they don't work. Number one is that the high computational demands of these models while training. So yeah, you obviously have these powerful models. You have data sets that you can use, but they take a lot of time and effort to train them. State of the art models can take anywhere from days to weeks to train a single model. So this is the training part of the things that make development and use of these AI solutions difficult. But that's not just it. There are also hardware constraints in terms of deployed robots. So all of these hardware are very expensive that can run AI models. So right now the issue is the global semiconductor shortage. Because of that, the all the higher end models are very expensive for running these AI systems. And even if you get some very costly hardware, you will still have some kind of latency issue, that there will be a delay between when the AI model makes an inference and that is then used by the robot's actuator to do some tasks. So this really causes a lot of issues, and all of the AI models of today cause these issues. So that is not just it. Also on the hardware side of things, there is a high energy demand. So uh, to just showcase how much more it is compared to classical system, some self-driving cars would consume a few thousand watts for such computations like navigation and seeing object detection and what kind of things are there on the road. Compare that to how the human brain works, and that only takes less than 20 watts of energy. So because of all these issues, we cannot really use AI solutions in the wild. So this is why we use spiking neural networks. So basically with spiking neural networks, we have certain advantages over all of the other methods. Number one is the similarity with nature that it brings. So in nature, information is generally processed using relatively small population of spikes. We'll talk about this a bit later, but basically there are some kind of responses to some situations, and then that they cause spikes, and that is sufficient enough to drive learning behavior and actually learn about all these environments and tasks that the robots have to do. Number two is energy efficient. So data is not treated like how it is treated in regular deep learning, but it is encoding in a very efficient manner, and that takes a fraction of energy. It is something called pulse coding, which will come a bit later. So uh, the advantages of these spiking neural networks is, the best thing is that they are better suited for control applications. So in robotics, uh, basically what we do is control things, and spiking neural networks are inherently better controllers than any of the classical or AI based solutions, because they rely on something called spikes. So because of these spikes, all of these spikes are time based, so they also carry temporal information, and that kind of temporal information is very useful for robotics. So this is why we use spiking neural networks. So let's just take a bit of a dive into what are spikes anyway. So uh, you can see this structure of a neuron on the left side of the screen, and you will see that there are on the in the center of the cell body of the neuron, you have the nucleus, and coming out of it are dendrites. So from each dendrite you will have some kind of voltage coming in, and that voltage contains of the messages that have to be processed by the neuron, nucleus of the neuron. So uh, basically if you have a lot of voltage coming in from all these dendrites, then it will cross over the neuronal membrane of these neurons, and then at some certain threshold, these will reach into the cell body, and this action potential is actually what is called spikes, or the pulse that the message is carrying. So this entire process of basically suddenly increasing the voltage and then processing the messages that is coming with these voltage is called spiking or firing of a neuron. So when you hear the sentence or phrase firing, neurons firing, so this is basically what it is. So spiking neural networks is based on this mapping of how human brain works, and basically in spiking neural networks we directly communicate to the real world with the individual sequences of spikes. So basically if you have you generally have data in deep learning. Instead of that, we use here abstracted signal information that is pulse coded, in which way you are able to not only just use the data that is coming in, but also use the spatial, that is the space based, and temporal, that is the time based information that might be useful in processing some kind of task that are not really responsive at one point, but they take some time to actually make sense about what is going on in the surroundings of robot. So now we need to discuss how exactly do spiking neural networks benefit robotics. So we saw some of the things that why we use them in robotics, but there are some factors which make SNNs really useful for robotics. And so number one of them is the biological plausibility. So many biological neural systems use the timings of a single action potential. So these spikes that come from the dendrites of a neuron structure. So these contain encoded information, and that is then processed by the individual neurons. So This kind of biological similarity of SNNs with their implemented structure makes things really useful for robotics applications, because they are not just dependent upon long-term data, but also uh, very responsive data. So the second thing that benefit robotics about the spiking neural networks is obviously the speed and energy efficiency. So SNNs are not only able to run all of these things with a few spikes, but they can also receive large volumes of data and encode them in relative timings. So that makes the use of low power hardware possible in case of SNNs. Number three is the computational capabilities of these neural networks. So instead of using abstracted data encoded in some kind of format, which may be an image that we may use as matrix or something, we here use timing based uh, encoding mechanisms that increase increase the precision and accuracies of all of these models, and then they give much better results than traditional neural networks. So the last thing that SNN's aspect of really benefiting robotics is the information processing. So we have been using this term pulse coding. So at this point, it is pretty clear that the information is coming in terms of spikes or pulses, and that is encoded as a, and then so we use these pulse coding mechanisms. In general, what is used is time or rate based methods in deep learning, where even if you have a large matrix, it will take you some time to actually go through all of the parts of that matrix, and then the different extract the different features and use them. What happens in spiking neural networks now is that you have all of these uh, pulse coding based information encoded, and then these there are efficient algorithms that are able to work on large scale grids and matrices, and then extract features in a position invariant manner, and that it really helps in reducing the amount of time it takes. So if we talk about the general design framework of SN-based robots, so number one, we obviously define the topology and the structure of the SNNs, and then determine what kind of neuron model that we want to use here. So that could be related to reinforcement learning, where you want your robot to actually learn from its surroundings, or it can be unsupervised, where you don't really have a lot of data, or it could be supervised, that you're using the data to drive the learning behaviors. So after this creation of SNNs, you will then initialize the SNNs. So there is a lot of literature on what kind of weights and biases that each synapse needs to be initialized on, and that is very specific to spiking neural networks. So using that, you will initialize these spiking neural networks. So this part of the process will take the perception of the robots, and you will have some kind of encoding that you take into this part of the structure, the process of your spiking neural network based robot, and then you will have the actual learning. So you firstly determine what exactly is the output of your spiking neural network, and then you define the episode termination and restart of learning, and what will happen during the learning, and then you will start the training and train your model and implement them finally by doing some kind of validations in predefined scenarios, and then explore your models and optimize them for unknown scenarios. And you use all of this for decoding actuations. So you have some kind of action that the robot has to take, that is being predicted by the model, and then you will do these actuations on the real robot. So now we will briefly talk about some of the real world robots that are based on spiking neural networks. So number one here is simulated vehicles that is being controlled by a spiking neural network. So we have a feed-forward spiking neural network with 16 neurons, and that is controlling the steering wheel of a car through an actuator, and all of this work is being done in robot operating system. So we have the image of the road coming in. We have a spiking neural network based net model, AI model, and that is finally giving output to if the car should go left or right. And based on them, we have some tracks where the car is being driven, and with a fairly good accuracy. This research work was done in 2016, and the robot was able to drive on these tracks. So similarly, we have here a obstacle avoidance robot. So this was done in a simulated fashion. So a basic snake and we have control of a 4 degree of freedom robot arm, uh, where a single layer spiking neural network is getting information about the joint angles and spatial angles of the motors attached to that robot, and then using these inputs to train the network, and then the network is giving output as the 4 motor commands of the robotic arm, and that is actually performing uh, action for the robot arm using the actuators inside them. There are also a few simulators that are made specifically for spiking neural networks. One of them is Robotics platform that was created under the EU flagship project, the Human Brain Project. And spiking neural networks are actually part of the brain simulator package and can be used under this framework to help control the robot's behaviors and actions. Another popular thing is Gazebo, which is a open source 3D robotics simulator, and that has a lot of integrations for different physics based engines, and it is typically used with ROS. And depicted here is a Brettenberg vehicle that is simulated in a realistic environment, and that is actually using a spiking neural network. So finally, we have some research opportunities. This spiking neural networks in the context of robotics is an emerging field, and there is not a lot of research work done here. So if we are able to answer questions like how is diverse information coded in many neural activities other than rates and timings of spikes, so how can we use other formats of data into spiking neural networks? If we are able to answer this, then it will open many doors of the kind of applications that we can use. uh, Another question is how does the brain simulate future? So this is basically about how does it take in the previous steps of what it has done, and then uh, predict based on these previous steps. So this is done in part in reinforcement learning, but specifically in the case of spiking neural networks, the concept of memory is not very well defined. So another research opportunity here is that there is no general design framework like PyTorch or TensorFlow that traditional neural networks have, where you can just plug in, play with APIs using something like Keras, and then design and implement your own spiking neural network. So that creates a lot of problems for researchers as well as developers. And finally, if we are able to integrate spike neural network based controllers into neuromorphic devices, which are specifically created for uh, neuro in neuro computer science based applications, then they will have a lot of potential for improvements in terms of speed and accuracy. So the primary resource used for this was a survey in robotic control based on spiking neural networks learning. And yeah, with this, the seminar is concluded. Thank you for attending.